Hello, you're getting ready to watch today's lecture on agenda setting theory. As you know, this is one of our theories from the media unit. You probably also, if you've already had a chance to look at the chapter, recognize that this theory is an objective theory. So as such, we'll be evaluating it based on objective criteria by the end of the lecture. And you know that the theory was developed by scholars McCombs and Shaw. So with that in mind, the goal for today is to talk about some of the key components of agenda setting theory. And specifically, I want to do that in this lecture by examining some of the original research that was done to help kind of build or help the theory develop. In addition to that, we're going to talk about some specific vocabulary, including things like residence and framing. And again, as I mentioned, we will make sure to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of the theory. So with that in mind, we'll kind of jump in here today. So the major principle of agenda setting theory is the idea that mass media has the ability to transfer the salience of issues of their news agenda to the public agenda. So this sounds kind of fancy, but essentially all that's suggesting is the media has the power to tell the public what's important. And specifically, the media can tell us what we should be thinking about. Here is a really good quote to kind of elaborate on that. It suggests that press or media is stunningly successful at telling its readers what to think about, but not necessarily what to think. Now, I put that quote up there for a reason, because definitely early on with the development of agenda setting theory, Shaw and McCombs simply suggested that the media tells the audience what to think about, but not necessarily how to think about or what to feel about the topics. As the theory developed, their stance on this has kind of evolved and changed a little, and we'll talk about that throughout today's lecture. But at least at its core, at least at the beginning of the theoretical development of agenda setting theory, the major principle of the theory is that media can tell us what to think about, what issues are important, but not necessarily how to feel about those issues. And like I said, what I want to do today during our lecture is talk about some of the research that was done to develop that idea. And so we'll start by looking at a landmark study done at UNC Chapel Hill, where this was kind of the initial study that helped to develop a link between the media agenda and the public agenda. So I want to kind of walk you through that. Essentially, what the researchers did was, and this was back in 1968, this is around the time of the presidential election. It was between the candidates Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. And what the researchers did was they examined 9 different media sources. And this included both print sources and broadcast sources. And once they examined those sources, they specifically looked for the important stories. In other words, the stories that they felt the media was part of the media agenda. And in order to figure out what were the important stories, they established a set of criteria for story prominence. The stories that were written in print had to be on the front page, and the stories had to be at least 3 columns long to fit this criteria. The stories that were covered during broadcast had to be one of the first 3 items of the media broadcast and needed to be at least 45 seconds long. So again, those were the criteria used to determine what the media agenda was, or what the important stories of the time were. Based on that analysis, they identified 5 key stories or 5 key issues. That included issues related to foreign policy, issues related to law and order, fiscal policy, welfare, and civil rights issues. Okay, so now remember, those were the issues that they're claiming the media are putting forth as the important issues of the time. Once they established that, then they went out and they collected a sample of undecided voters who had acknowledged at least some amount of media viewership. And then they asked those voters what were the most important issues to them. And what they found was a significant match between the media agenda and then the agenda of these individuals, or what you would call the public's agenda. So based on this data, we can make the argument that there is indeed a correlation between media and public agenda. Now, with that in mind, although we can establish that there's a correlation, we aren't necessarily able yet to determine what causes what. Right. So in that case, was it that the media was talking about and covering certain issues more, and therefore that was leading the voters to think those issues were the most important? Or it's possible that was it because the voters had certain issues on their mind and that they were talking about these things, and because the voters wanted to know more about certain topics, that was actually causing the media to cover those topics. As you guys know, I'm sure you've taken, some research methods classes or covered in some of the other courses. Correlation does not mean causation. And so this particular study, although it did establish a correlation between the public agenda and the media agenda, at this point, we can't really make a claim which came first. So additional research was necessary. So let's talk about another really landmark study here. So another really important study that helped to develop the agenda setting theory was done at Yale. And in this particular study, what they did was they actually brought in, a sample of participants, and they divided the participants into separate groups. And then each group of people viewed different news stories and, watched different news topics. Right. And then after that, they asked the participants about, what issues were important, right? Essentially, they measured perceptions related to the public agenda. What they found was that, it's not just a correlation between a media agenda and public agenda, but what they found was that the groups that saw stories about certain topics went on to then say those were in fact the most important topics that should have been covered. So if you were in the group that watched news coverage of environmental pollution, you were much more likely to say that one of the most important issues of the day was environmental pollution. Other groups watched things regarding national defense or economic inflation, and if you were in those groups, you were much more likely to say that those were the most important issues of the times. So this was a really important study that helped move us from identifying a correlation between media agenda and public agenda towards the idea of causation, that what people are finding to be important, what people are thinking about, is in fact influenced by the media. And at this point, I'll kind of pause and point out, as your book points out, this is really what they call level 1 agenda setting, right? Level 1 agenda setting is the idea that the media tells us what issues to think about. Now, above and beyond that, some additional research has been done to kind of question whether, if that's where things stop or if the media has some additional power. So let's look at some more research. Okay, here's an additional study. This study was done by Trombo in the early 2000s. And in this particular study, what he did was he monitored the headlines specifically regarding the topic of getting flu vaccines. Right, and the efficacy of the flu vaccination. And then in addition to that, he monitored doctor visits and the vaccination rates. And what he found was that media coverage of flu vaccines did in fact influence the next week's rates of attendance at doctors' offices. So again, what he's establishing by a study like this is showing a cause and effect. When media talks about a topic, in this case, the flu, and specifically the flu vaccination, then the public agenda follows, right? And in this case, not only did this study suggest that the media can influence what we think about, but the media can also influence actual behavior. Right? People actually weren't just thinking that talking about the flu is important and being aware of flu vaccine is important. People actually went out and got vaccinated after watching news coverage of flu vaccines. Okay. All right, so moving on, we do need to talk about a really important concept here that's part of agenda theory, and that's this idea of framing. You probably have heard the term of framing before, but I've got the definition there listed directly from the textbook. According to your textbook authors, framing is this idea that because anytime a media covers a certain topic, they are restricted by certain features, right? Whether it's the length of time that the story can run, if it's on a broadcast, or it's the word count, if it's in a newspaper or if it's an online article. Anytime the media is restricted by a certain feature, then they must choose what elements to include or not include in their coverage of a story. right? And of course, we know there's a lot of different ways that the media can choose to do this, right? It can be done verbally through the words that are used. It can be done non-verbally through pictures. It can be done based on the way the material is organized, what comes first, what comes last. It can be done, who's being cited in the story, whose testimony is included or not included. As your book points out, there's tons of different ways the media can frame an issue. Right? Who's deciding how the issues get framed? Well, the media or agenda setting theory would argue it's up to the gatekeepers, right? So it's not just that media is telling us certain stories and presenting us information, it's that media gets to serve as a gatekeeper and gets to kind of choose what information is in fact being emphasized and we're getting our attention drawn to, and what information is being left out. Okay. So this brings us to the second level of agenda theory. So the second level of agenda theory argues that the media, in addition to telling us what issues to think about, the media also can tell us which aspects of those issues are most important. In other words, the media can tell us how to think about things. Your book gives an example of the Bluebell ice cream. I don't know if you guys are very familiar with the Bluebell company or not. I know my brother-in-law is from the South, and he loves Bluebell ice cream, and feels pretty strongly about it being the very best ice cream. As your book points out, decades ago, Bluebell ice cream had a listeria outbreak that went on to sicken several people, and in fact, a few people died from the listeria outbreak. And the book provides a really interesting example of how that story was covered nationally in comparison to Texas and other southern states where the company was so popular. Right? And so I encourage you to check that out. Whether you were watching national news or whether you were from Texas and watching local news, you would likely have a very different perspective on this outbreak and very different perspective on this company based on the news coverage. Some other examples that we might be even more familiar with, probably one of the most controversial examples within the last few years here involved the coverage of President Trump's inauguration. Right? And depending on which news channel you tuned into, you would likely have very different perceptions about the event itself and about the attendance at the event. Right? So you can see wildly different pictures there. Clearly, each outlet was trying to frame the event in very different ways, right, based on these pictures. Here's one more example. You may have heard in the news recently that Indiana University basketball coach Bob Knight recently passed away. And I found this story, particularly interesting. You guys, I think, know that I grew up in Indiana, and I actually grew up I went to Purdue for my degree, but I actually grew up a pretty big IU fan. My next door neighbor, some of our really good family friends, was actually on Bob Knight's basketball team in 1987, the year they won the national championship. So anyway, I certainly found this story really interesting. It really caught my eye, and especially from a framing standpoint, I thought it was pretty fascinating. You can see there the coverage on the left is from a local news source, a source out of Indiana. And you can see what they've done is, as part of the headlines, they have provided a quote from Bob Knight's son. And, it speaks to his family. And on the right, you can see a website, or CBS website, that talks about Bob Knight's passing in a little bit different way and acknowledges the controversy that surrounded Knight and some of his coaching tactics. And you can't see it on the screen right now, but if you actually were able to scroll down and look at CBS's coverage of the event, one of the very first things that they provide is a quote that Bob Knight actually said a few years back about when he passes. And I kind of became famous for saying that once he was gone, he hoped that people, or that he was buried head down so that any of his critics could kiss his ass. And so anyway, you can see that the coverage of this event looked very different. Whether you were receiving coverage from Indiana, from the Hoosier state where he was pretty legendary, or at this more national level. For your engagement assignment for this unit, I'm going to ask you to think more about this concept of framing and to examine another instance where different news outlets may be framing issues differently and consequently may be influencing not just the issue that people think about, but how people think about that issue. Okay, so we're going to get a lot more practice at this. All right, finally, that brings us to our third level of agenda setting and kind of the final evolution of the agenda setting theory, and that is that in addition to telling us what to think about and how to think about those topics, the media can also tell us how different issues may or may not be connected. Right? And so I've given you an example here. Certainly immigration is a topic that we often see covered in the news. Media outlets can persuade us that certain topics may or may not be related to immigration depending on their coverage of that particular topic. Right? In fact, I also just saw a recent example of this. It was based on some of the coverage of what's going on right now in the Gaza Strip and the war between Hamas and Israel. And the news outlet that I was watching covered this event and showed lots of very graphic images and addressed the conflict kind of on the ground. And then the very next story that they covered was actually about what they claimed was Israel's perception of Benjamin Netanyahu and how he was being blamed for the war. And I wish I kind of had the clip here because I'm not probably doing a great job summarizing, but my perspective on that was that it was a genuine effort to try to dissuade anyone from pointing the finger at the United States for having fault or blame in any way. Because the United States is in this very kind of tricky, precarious position right now. And so at least one effort to kind of divert attention away from what the U.S. should or should not be doing was to point the blame squarely on Israel's prime minister and to kind of connect those two stories. Anyway, for what that's worth, make sure you are familiar that the third level of agenda setting is the idea that the media can kind of group stories together for us or make comparisons to how two stories may be similar or how the issues may be different. Okay. All right. One other really important part of this theory addresses the idea of, well, so who is most influenced by the media agenda? Right? Are we all just passive observers that are just kind of taking in whatever we see on our phones or our TVs? Well, I think McComb and Shaw would say, no, not exactly. You know, that's oversimplifying the matter. What they have addressed is this concept called need for orientation. And they've argued that that is actually a really strong predictor of how susceptible someone is to the media coverage or media agenda. So need for orientation, also sometimes called your index for curiosity, refers to your desire to be in the know and to figure things out. And what McCombs and Shaw argue is that someone who has a high need for orientation is much more likely to be consuming a lot of media coverage and going to be watching a lot more news. And so based on that, they argue that someone with a high need for orientation, who's watching a lot more news, is a lot more susceptible to the media agenda than someone who has a low need for orientation or who is not watching much news. Related to that, the theorists also argue that two key elements of a story can really influence your need for orientation. So although it might be a little bit of a personality trait that some people just have a higher need for orientation than others, aspects of the story might also increase or decrease your need for orientation. If the story is particularly relevant to you and relatable, then that's going to increase your need for orientation. Additionally, if there's a lot of uncertainty or unknowns about the story, that also is going to increase your need for orientation, right? And we probably shouldn't be surprised by that, right? After spending some time talking about uncertainty reduction theory, we know that in general, human beings do not like uncertainty and do whatever we can to try to reduce it, right? So when I think about these factors, I mean, it's dreadful stories that we have to talk about, but immediately two relatively recent stories that I think about have to do with mass shootings. And frankly, my recollection is a few months ago when the shooting took place on Michigan State University's campus, I had an extremely high need for orientation. It felt very relevant, right? It was just down the road. It happened on a college campus. It affected students and faculty just like you and me. And there was a lot of unknowns about what happened and why. And so I just really felt myself kind of glued to the TV trying to figure out what was going on. Frankly, on the other hand, I have, had to watch other stories of other mass shootings, one in Maine recently. Although I certainly was engaged and certainly upset and certainly wanted to know what was happening there, I didn't have that same need for orientation in the way I did with the MSU shooting. I think probably because it took place far away. It did not, specifically affect a college campus, and so on, right? So certainly you can probably think about where you might consider yourself in terms of your overall need for orientation, and then you can appreciate how the relevance or the uncertainty of a story might either increase or decrease your need for orientation. Okay. All right, so we're right at 21 minutes here, so I'll wrap things up by applying the objective criteria to this theory, and you can see that in general the theory gets really positive marks. I think it's important to note that when the theory was originally being developed, a lot of the new media types of sources that we have now didn't even exist. And yet several of their ideas are still quite applicable, right? I think most of us would still kind of agree that it makes sense to think that the media can, in fact, influence what we think is important. The media does, in fact, influence how we think about certain topics, right? And no doubt we turn to certain news media outlets specifically because we're looking for them to reinforce how, we might want to feel or address an issue. And of course, I think we still can agree that that third level of agenda setting also applies. The media can influence how we group certain issues together or connect them. In addition to that, we can see high marks there for other criteria of an objective theory. We went through a variety of studies that empirically provided evidence for the support of the theory. So absolutely, the theory does have, or does provide us with testable predictions, right? And then provides us with accurate explanation of the data. The theory is very practically useful, right? It's pretty straightforward. So for all those reasons, I think the theory has a lot of strengths and will no doubt kind of stick around. All right, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.